you know, I followed him around. Right when I first came, I was in the political science department, and he was mentoring me. He moved over to the policy school. I moved over to the policy school. Right? So, Chris, thank you so much for your companionship and leadership. So, but today we once again get a chance to celebrate Ted. And Rebecca, thank you so much for doing this. And I really want to welcome you all to the John D. O'Brien African American Institute. I would imagine most of you all have been here before. But we really, truly appreciate it when we have events like this that continue to highlight the legacy of folks that are from our university on our campus and the work that they have done to make Northeastern a better place. And without further ado, I pass it over to Rebecca and Ted. All right.
Thank you so much, Richard. And can we also collectively thank Richard, not just for allowing us to use this space, but for creating important spaces throughout the network for us to be having these essential conversations. It's really something that we all recognize and celebrate and appreciate.
And it's something we can't take for granted. I mean, there are many campuses where the kind of conversation we're about to have either been banned or suppressed in a way that goes to the very core of what's supposed to happen on a college or university campus, which is to say some open dialogue. We might disagree on some things, we might not, but it's about having a safe space where we can talk to each other about hard subjects. And hopefully we'll be able to accomplish that today. I know that I would not have had the life that I've had I not been involved with some very hard ethical conversations while I was in college. It shaped my thinking about a whole lot of policy choices that I've made since. And as faculty, we have an obligation to try to give you the same kind of safe spaces where you can say what you really feel without risk. First of all, thank you for being here. And secondly, don't hold back. Go.
Thank you, Ted. Yeah, and so we're here because we believe deeply that social movements play an essential role in our history, our present, and our future. We want to talk about the beauty of them, the power of them, the messiness of them, and the risk of them. This work is not without risk. And so we want to create a space where we can talk about all of that. We also recognize that social movements span the political spectrum, as they should in a democracy. People should be able to organize and speak and try to build people power to effect transformative change. And we might not always agree with what those movements are about, but we must make sure that they remain an integral part of how civil society works in this country. It is part of what makes civil society in this country so unique. We are going to leave time for questions, but we ask, rather than taking the risk of not getting to everybody, we have set up the opportunity using this QR code, or if you're online, Allie is dropping the bit.ly. I also want to thank Allie, one of my former students, who is helping us with the tech, and Danita as well. Thank you so much for making this happen. And our colleague in the policy school, Kim Lucas, is going to be scanning those questions as they come in to look for themes and things that maybe we haven't had a chance to talk about. So want to just thank everybody who's made this possible. College of Social Sciences and Humanities, the Policy School in our 20th year, also the Human Services Program, and the Dukakis Center are all part of bringing this together. It is a school-wide effort. So I'm going to dive in. You ready?
Go.
Okay. If we use AI, which we're all encouraged to do more and more here, but if you used it to understand the civil rights movement, it would tell you that it ended in 1968. But oftentimes when you and I are chatting, you will often refer to the movement. which I hear with a capital T and a capital M. And I hear that as recognition that it is a struggle that never ended and a way of being in the world. Am I hearing that correct?
Yeah, and the movement, as we describe it, is part of a through line that has engaged issues of social justice in this country actually for a couple of hundred years. And we're only in a moment right now. It's a moment that many of us view as horrible or horrendous or threatening or certainly scary, but it's just a moment. And part of what I've certainly learned over the years is that good times come and go. And that as frustrated as we may feel about some of what's going on in terms of policymaking nationally and internationally at this moment, it is our sense of purpose and our mission and our adherence to those that overcomes the bad times. So we're in a tough moment, but it's not a moment that's going to last forever.
But the work will last forever.
The work will last forever. Part of the value of studying history and anthropology is that you get to see that hundreds and indeed thousands of years ago, some of the same issues were still being dealt with. And so we're part of an ongoing movement. That's why it's considered the movement. And that's why leaders within the movement may come and have an impact and then leave us. But the fact of the matter is that we all have a role to play, no matter how big or small it may be, and that we're part of an ongoing continuum.
And we're going to come back to this issue of what does it take to keep it going? Because it isn't, there's a lot of data out there saying when you're pushing back against democratic backsliding, it might take 10 years and that's so long. And first of all, 10 years in the continuum that you're talking about is nothing. But also, why are we not just all committing to spending the rest of our lives building the world that we want to see? And I think that is such a much more constructive way to think about that, as opposed to having these like short-term goals that are either going to make us successful or not. So we'll come back to that.
Yeah, one of the things we certainly talk about in the policy school is the metrics of our success or failure at any point in time. And at this moment, if we look at some of the metrics, employment numbers or health disparities or issues of homelessness or voting participation or employment and training program availability, a range of things. It would be very easy to be frustrated that we see, for example, fewer students of color involved in higher education, fewer faculty, fewer staff, people being thrown out of the country who were permitted to be here not that long ago, people who are getting sick today who wouldn't have gotten sick 10 years ago. We see those kinds of metrics, and inevitably they lead to a certain kind of frustration and despair. But the fact of the matter is, it's because we keep pushing forward to make improvements that we do, in fact, make improvements.
And we encounter resistance along the way, right?
All the time.
Yeah, all the time.
Big time resistance.
Yep.
And not the kind of resistance we're going to talk about.
Right.
Let me also say that we're not here this afternoon or this evening to organize you, except that we are. The most important thing that I would hope would be a takeaway from our conversation, and it is a conversation, it's not just Rebecca and me presenting, is the need for ongoing engagement with social issues for the rest of your lives. That's the real deal. And that engagement transcends having a good job and having a family and paying your mortgage and getting or not getting a car or whatever. The engagement at whatever level is what makes the difference. And the fact that you're here, of course, means that we're what's that expression about Eskimos and ice cream or something? I mean, you're here because you're already converted to the concept, to the premise that you're engaged in making the world better. But we're here to remind you that there are tools that you can use to make that possible, and also that it's a lifelong endeavor. It doesn't go away.
Because you just have me thinking of something that it's important, and we do have actual questions that we're going to talk about in just a minute.
Yeah.
But this man improvises really well. That there is a difference between getting activated to come to something like this and maybe being mobilized to go to an action or mobilized to go to an action and actually organizing. And that's what we're talking about here, is staying involved long enough and in enough different ways to actually be organizing and building people power. And I would love to sort of go back in time a little bit and think about kind of your path into this work, because you once told me that you were in Selma but did not get to walk across the bridge with John Lewis because you were making sandwiches in the church, I think. Do I have that more or less right?
That is correct.
So those were the most important sandwiches you ever made.
Yeah.
And
delicious.
Right? And it's true that day, that was the most important thing you could be doing, right? I like the act of making sandwiches it's kind of a metaphor. I don't want to say that was the most important thing you ever did, but like at that moment, right? So first of all, what got you to that point where you actually had a supporting role in the day? What was your path to that day?
I was a college student, I think a junior. And of course, I read about and heard about the march. And I'm going to digress just a little.
You may.
But I felt that my conscience couldn't permit me to just sit in my dorm room in New Haven and not participate at some level. And I had done some civil rights stuff in New York before that, organizing rent strikes and getting arrested in anti-war movements and, the stuff that high school and college kids do. When you grow up in New York and you're surrounded by all of these people who are activists. And so the word got to me that there was this march going on, and I felt in good conscience that I couldn't just sit on my couch and let all of this stuff go on without my participating. And I decided I had to go to Selma. There was a place on campus, much like this, that brought students and faculty and activists together. Someone had put up a little 3x5 card saying that they were driving from New Haven down to Selma. And they were looking for one or two passengers to go with them. And so I got on the phone and called these two guys who were divinity school students from the Midwest, really nice guys, and white. We all agreed that we would get together, with just little backpacks, and that we would go down to Selma together. So they drove up to where my dorm was, and I came out and started to get in the car. And I know both of them looked at each other and they said, "Oh, no." a black guy and two white divinity students getting in a car driving through the South to Selma, Alabama with Connecticut license plates. That this is not really smart. And they had a brief conversation to which I was not a party. And they decided we're going to go anyway, right? And this was about the time when several civil rights workers had gone south and had been killed. They'd been followed out of a town and killed. So we had the conversation. We agreed we were going to go. It was a matter of faith that was going to take us to Selma. And from driving from New Haven to basically Virginia was no big deal. But then once we started to get into the deep South, we began to encounter some challenging moments, including one where we'd driven all night and we went into the local breakfast spot, luncheonette kind of place. And it was full of guys who were about to go out to their jobs, 6 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, in the fields and, as mechanics and whatever. And the place was packed. And I was the only black person in the place. And that was not a part of my agenda in terms of deciding that I was going to go south. And so we went in, we found 3 seats together at the counter. We sat down together and then we waited and we waited and we waited. And eventually, with people looking up at us periodically, without a lot of joy on their faces. And eventually, the woman behind the counter came up to us, and she said, I'm sorry, boys, but I just can't serve you." And she had tears in her eyes as she was saying this. And then she said, "You better leave." And our goal was, of course, to get to Selma and not necessarily to integrate a luncheonette somewhere in the backwoods of Alabama or Georgia or wherever we were. And so we got up and we got in the car and we started to drive out of town. And sure enough, there were a couple of pickup trucks with, gun racks across the back window that followed us to the county line. And we were, needless to say, scared to death that at any moment they would pull ahead of us and run us off the road and kill us, because it had happened not long before. And fortunately, when we got to the county line, they stopped and we drove on and we got to Selma, and everything was essentially as cool as it was going to be. But as a kid who'd grown up in New York, used to seeing all different kinds of people, I had rarely been as terrified as I was as a college student at that moment, in part because I had made the decision to make the trip without calling to tell my mom.
That was the thing you were most afraid of.
I was terribly afraid of that because, the fact of the matter was that I didn't want her finding out that I'd made this trip by reading about it in the newspaper. That would not have been cool, given the investment she had made in getting me to college in the first place.
And there's a very good university in New Haven, by the way, which
Yeah.
is where he.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was at that moment and at the subsequent moments, making sandwiches, being in the background, hiding from night riders at night when I got lost in Selma, which at the time had no sidewalks, streets, but we had been warned that if we got lost at night, there would be people cruising the streets looking to pick us up and to do us harm. And of course, I got lost and spent part of the night literally in the bushes, hiding from these people riding around looking for civil rights workers to do harm to. It was at that moment that I realized that the demonstrations I had participated in, the work that I was doing around rent strikes and those kinds of things in the North were all well and good, but that there were people who lived there all the time, who welcomed us as Northerners into their homes, fed us, and saw to it that we had a good place to sleep, that they were the ones we were doing the work for, that it wasn't about me and my ego and my sense of commitment. It was about serving other people who lived like that all the time and were oppressed all the time. And that my own conscience was such that I couldn't let them do it alone. And that it was up to me for the balance of my life to make a commitment that I would provide that kind of service to people who were not fortunate enough to be in a fancy college in New Haven, and not as well off as I was even as a college student. And so that's what has motivated me. And also it's what motivates me here at Northeastern. Because, and I'll say this and then I'll shut up. We live in quite a privileged bubble here. To be here in whatever capacity is to be in a fairly privileged position, not just in the world of higher ed or in the United States, but in the world at large. We're well fed. We have health care. We can get to beauticians, and we can go to clubs at night, and we have internet, and we have AI and a bunch of other things. And we owe it to those less privileged than we are to share the relative wealth that we have. That sharing is an essential part of who we are as human persons. And so, through my teaching and the work we do in the policy school and elsewhere, I mean, that's the basis of the commitment. And that's why we're here. And I know you feel the same because you're on the line more than I am at this moment. But anyway, that was a long answer.
First of all, I want to thank you for sharing that story. I had heard parts of it, but not all of it. And it brings up so many things I would love to unpack. One is, there have been times in your life, like the day the picture was taken, where you were just walking to work. There were times in your life when you were a young man, a Black man who had been active in New York, but hadn't really experienced the kind of terror that I imagine you were feeling in the bushes that night. And so, what it is to walk into risk. You experienced sort of, in times, violence against you, the risk of violence against you that you had not necessarily chosen fully to enter. But after those times, you continued, after having been terrorized, after having experienced that vulnerability, to take risks, more fully aware of what could befall you. And you did it fully informed. And that's something I'd like to talk about in movement spaces, because this change of the magnitude we need does not happen without some risks. And so, how did you make the decision to walk into the risk intentionally, knowing what it could entail? Professional risk, physical risk, personal friendships risked. How do you find the courage?
Well, This is a collaborative conversation, and I'm going to bounce the question back to you because you have served as and trained as a marshal for demonstrations held here and elsewhere. You've raised your kids to be committed to a set of values that are about equity and fairness. And you've said to me that you don't look like a typical supporter of marches for social justice. And I've agreed with you. So why do you keep going back to that role where, in fact, you're putting yourself at risk, not only in terms of your values, but in terms of your physical being?
It's interesting. It's because the work has to be done. Because of my childhood, which was obviously very different from yours, a child of the 70s. So it's a weird mix of Star Trek and watching the Watergate hearings and being raised in a Catholic immigrant family that was so grateful that it's about giving back, that as I got older and learned more about the civil rights movement and watched miniseries like Roots and the Holocaust, it just became deeply embedded. And I don't want to pretend at all that what I do as a white person, which innately just gives me a certain level of protection that you don't have, is the same kind of thing. There is risk, there's physical risk. But part of it, I think, is being aware that as a white person, I can do things to advance this movement and put myself on the line, knowing I am still at less risk than the people who I hope are being able, who can gather and feel a little bit safer, who can speak and be heard. So while there's risk, I think it's just magnitudes different. And it's really important to name that, I think.
Okay, but there are white people, even in the last couple of weeks, who've been shot and killed, accosted, beaten. They're taking huge risks around principle. I mean, none of those folks who've made that sacrifice at this point, as far as I could tell, had to make that sacrifice.
No, it's true. You don't have to. I think the question is, are you going to embody your values or not? Right? And I think that there is such a difference between understanding these things intellectually or conceptually and recognizing, just like you recognize that those folks in the South were living that every day. They were actually fighting oppression on a daily basis for the rest of us. Like how I could not allow other people to be carrying that burden and not be a part of it. So I think that piece, like the utter commitment to values, is just a part of it. But I don't want everybody to think that you have to get to the place where you're ready to get harmed. This kind of gets back in a weird way, back to the sandwiches, right? Because there are so many roles that have to play. So one thing I wouldn't want us to convey is you got to get ready to be hurt, because you don't start there. I didn't start there. You walked into it early and young and you faced it right away. And a lot of that is because you're a Black man. I did not start walking into danger and ready to get harmed or physically hit or something. So the muscle building is something I would like us to talk to. Like, how do you grow from sitting here to perhaps taking on increasingly risky, not necessarily risk of violence, but where you're putting more and more on the line? What's the advice about that?
Yeah, and I just want to make a comment on the sandwiches. When we got to Selma, I mean, everyone sees Selma in terms of the photographs of the leaders crossing the Pettus Bridge, and everyone thinks, oh yeah, well, you know, participating in that kind of activity can be viewed as heroic. And you look at Dr. King and the others who were there, and you think to yourself, what a heroic, group of people, which of course they were. But behind that front line of marchers are all the people who are making sandwiches for them, or making phone calls, or doing fundraising, or ferrying people back and forth from where they were being put up in people's homes to the bridge. And, it's easy to equate being involved with the movement at some level as somehow making an heroic act. But in fact, most of the work is done in terms of very small acts, making sandwiches or writing postcards or making phone calls, or getting in touch with churches or family members or social clubs or whatever that constitute the infrastructure below the level of the documented heroic act, that's really the essence of the movement. And that's why, in relation to your first question about whether there's a movement that's going on, there is a huge movement that has continued, and the infrastructure is what amounts to the movement, and it's largely invisible. And you don't get a lot of credit for it. You don't show up at a cocktail party and have someone say, "Oh, I'm so proud of you for having made sandwiches." But it's that infrastructure that needs to be built and sustained that brings about the social change.
I could not agree more with that. You said something actually last week at the other event where you said, well, nobody goes into this for the recognition. And I wanted, first of all, to say some people do. You don't, right? And I think you and I have both had conversations about some of the most important movement work we have done. No one knows about, and no one ever will. Right. And it's not always glamorous. Some of that work you're talking about is kind of just nitty gritty and even boring. But it is essential. And I would say part of my advice is wherever you are now, take the next step to either a little bit more time, a little bit more money, a little bit more risk, and be thinking about building the muscles of that infrastructure. And it's the behind the scenes stuff that actually is. History tells us the story of Dr. King, of Rosa Parks, but it took over 40,000 people to keep that bus boycott going for over a year, right? And there were people who were giving out sandwiches or doing carpools and things like that to make the movement possible. And we don't know their names, but without them, we wouldn't have gotten to where we are.
Yeah, for a very long time, for example, women in the movement weren't recognized at all. They were doing all the hard work, not necessarily showing up for the big photo ops, not necessarily being invited to the stage to speak their truth, but invisible. Right. And to that extent, the same is happening at this moment. There are people who are doing the hard work, but it's largely invisible to social media and to major press. And sometimes, if you're not getting a lot of recognition, it's possible to feel a little bit frustrated. Why am I out here doing all this stuff? And that's when the importance of having an inner core of values makes the difference. That's why you're doing it. You're not doing it because it's going to make you rich and famous. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do. I would like, and I do want to leave some time for questions. I'm imagining Kim's got some good ones for us. I would like to talk a little bit, though, about allyship. And I would like us to juxtapose two well-known quotes of Dr. King's, one well-known, one less well-known, and just push a little bit on the way allies need to be stepping up more. Okay. So the first quote is very well known. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that's remaining awake through a great revolution, about 1968. The second one, I think less well known, but not as well known. Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions of passionate, concerned, and dedicated individuals. Do you think that the first one, which implies that justice is inevitable, that we are on the way, do you think that is something that allies who themselves are not experience oppression hold on to because it's soothing to think that justice is inevitable? Like, we got this. We have the civil rights movement. We got this. That arc is bending towards justice, and allows them to excuse themselves or absolve themselves from the responsibility of the sacrifice, the suffering, and the struggle, because the arc and the universe are taking care of it.
I like to believe that the arc of the universe is with us. Empirically, it's hard for me to accept that entirely. Bad stuff happens. You pick up the newspaper over the last 6 months, and you can see how a lot of the progress that we thought that we had achieved can be reversed cataclysmically and without any real warning. But that doesn't mean that we don't continue, because the positive effects, the metrics of our commitment to social justice aren't always readily visible. And I'll try to give a really quick example. After I was attacked on City Hall Plaza, I was invited by a bunch of spiritual leaders and a small handful of corporate leaders to talk to them about racism in Boston. And it was during the spring holiday season, Easter and stuff. And so I went out to a lot of church basements and synagogues and talked to people in greater Boston suburbs. A lot of white families and communities that had been complacent about what was going on in Boston, thinking that's a Boston thing. You know, that's folks in Southie or Charlestown. That's not us. And I asked them essentially to hold mirrors up to themselves about their employment practices, their real estate practices, their appraisal practices, the willingness that they had or didn't have to admit diverse people to their local public schools and the like. And many of them found themselves being kind of shocked and embarrassed that they could have been as complacent as they were about the level of racism that existed in Boston in their own office buildings downtown, 225 Franklin Street and what have you. And what we asked them to do was to not just accept Boston's diversity and their role in preventing diverse people from accessing jobs. What we asked them to do is to think about themselves and their own roles in terms of what they could do to begin to adjust. And for the first time over a period of months, and it's hard to think that Boston was like this, but it was. For the first time, you began to see waitresses of color in restaurants on Newbury Street. You began to see salespeople in Filene's basement who were people of color. You began to see court clerks and bus drivers who were women and people of color. And what people were starting to do out in our local suburbs that were perfectly happy to take a black kid from Metco, who was also a great football player, and put him on their suburban Boston white football team and have that team start to win games. All of a sudden, they realized that they were complicit in perpetuating institutional racism in the town in ways that had made them complacent. And of course, it took a couple of years, but after not that many years, you began to see higher diversity in, for example, some of our universities. You began to see secretaries in law firms who were bilingual. You began to see change, but to a large extent, at least in this part of the world, the complacency that we've seen has been based in practices and traditions that people just don't want to change. I remind everyone that if you pick up a copy of the Globe, or more importantly, probably Boston Magazine's annual issue on real estate, look at who is selling real estate. Look at the pictures of who the real estate brokers are in the greater Boston area. And you won't find, or you'll rarely find, a single person of color in the real estate, in the residential real estate business in the greater Boston area. To say nothing of lawyers or dentists or others, but I'm talking about being a real estate broker, selling someone a 2-bedroom condo in Needham, right? If we are willing to confront those levels of implicit and often explicit racism, you start to see that, in fact, that there are things we can do. But you have to be willing to hold up a mirror and say, I'm part of this bad set of values. And most of us in this part of the world are not willing to do that. I see more of that, in my little house down outside of Charleston, South Carolina, than I do here in Boston. We're very pleased with ourselves because we're so smart and so successful and so innovative. But I have to say that if you look at most of our universities, that doesn't show up for everyone who lives here.
The mirror never can go down.
No.
I want to ask one last question, and if we can keep people a little bit longer, you have time? Can we stay for
Sure.
a couple? All right. I want to acknowledge that I am very self-conscious about this question that I want to ask of you as a white person asking a Black person a question.
Okay.
One of the things that keeps me going in the work is the joy and solidarity I find with other people who do it. And to me, it seems so essential, even when we're in dangerous situations, even when we know things are going to get worse and we're training to engage with levels of violence we've never experienced before. That joy is so essential. But I know, again, as I said earlier, I'm never going to be at the level of risk that you might be. But I know you believe in the joy too. And I want us to end, before we take some questions, on that note of building friendship, across generations, across races, of finding that joy and solidarity in the work?
Well, it's essential. Um, if I hadn't been in positions where I could build those kinds of allegiances and alliances and friendships, I couldn't be here today. I've learned a lot from people who don't look and sound like myself. Um, and the joy, interestingly, in being a part of a movement like this, is that there's an intrinsic optimism. There's a belief that, in fact, we can make things better. And by most metrics, in fact, we've done that. More people are voting, more people are working, more people own homes, more people are raising their families without external supports, more people are healthier because we have collaborated with each other and because we believe in each other as human people. Um, More people are in a position to advance as a group than we possibly could if we were all operating on our own. And the title of our talk today, which I hope will um, engage with from this point forward, is how do we strategically develop the alliances and the action plans that make things better, right? How do we collaborate and with whom? How do we overcome our fear of people who aren't like ourselves to be effective in terms of implementing social change? And I'll just conclude by saying that at a place like this, and by this I mean Northeastern, which is full of diverse students and faculty and staff and even administrators. We have opportunities to learn from each other and to work with each other in ways that aren't always readily apparent in a lot of other industries and in a lot of other communities. And so the task that we have as part of this Northeastern community is to figure out how we build stronger interpersonal relationships with each other and with our neighbors, right? And we do that through events like this.
This will make you feel good. Can all the students in this room right now who are involved in one way or another with social and racial justice work, please raise your hand? Raise them high. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kim, are there one or two questions that you think kind of capture the theme of? You want to come out and you can use the mic here at the podium. Thank you so much for monitoring
Questions,
those.
comments.
Yeah. Yep. And if anybody hasn't had a chance yet, maybe we still have time for you to put them up using the QR code.
I want to take the limelight. Hi, everybody. We've got a couple questions here, and I'll start with one. The question asker says, as a Black student activist, I want to encourage my peers to get involved, but Black fatigue exists. Also, a feeling that if we support a movement, we will historically get the short end of the stick and livelihood will not improve. How would you encourage Black youth to engage in activism with factors negating motivation?
Well, I mean, there are lots of levels. One can be a tutor for kids who live across the street or in the projects next door. I tell my neighbors in JP that they can be effective learning who their neighbors are. And being willing to take in their garbage cans, if they forget to take in a garbage can. We have a ton of activities on this campus through sports and advising and counseling and workforce development and working with high school kids and what have you, and working with softball teams or squash and what have you. We have a ton of activities on this campus, many of which Richard is in the middle of coordinating, that enable all of us at whatever level to make contributions. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be tutoring 3 times a week. Sometimes it just means that you're going to step up and advise someone on how to think about going to college, or how to manage a family situation where there may be drugs involved. And many of our schools, whether it's engineering or DeMoore or CAMD or, policy school, have formal programs, but there's also a ton of informal stuff. And I think that the way you start to engage is in a simple one-on-one way. Get to know a person who's unlike yourself and volunteer a little bit of time and hope that that person is learning as much from you as you're learning from them.
Thank you. I have a question here that I'm actually very curious for both of you to answer, if you have an answer. The question asker says, how do you balance creating change within existing institutions versus establishing new systems altogether?
You want me to take that one?
Yeah.
This is an interesting question for me as a social change educator, because I know that my students are going to be coming out of our classes recognizing how deeply and systemically broken our social change industry is, and bringing those ideas into places where the problematic factors are pretty deeply entrenched. And I think this is where it's really important to be a systems thinker and to almost function on 2 different levels, where you are strategically navigating what is while you are embedding what you want it to become, and finding allies within those spaces so you know you're not alone. And I think that's one of the most important things, is to find your people. I see a lot of my people in this room tonight. I think Ted and I are each other's people in this work. Sometimes we just go into our office and we talk through things together. And then we go back into the world and we do the best we can in that world and push and accept, as hard as it is, that sometimes change is incremental, because we are a very flawed species. And we're each here for just a flash of the continuum of the human experience. And the question is, what good can I do in this flash? And how can I use that to push it a little bit further for the next person? And that's kind of my solution.
I would add 2 things. One is you absolutely have to have a sense of where you want to end up. What is the outcome that you want to achieve, and what are the metrics that you're using qualitatively as well as quantitatively? What are the metrics that you want to use to determine whether you're actually making progress towards that? And as you achieve those outcomes, celebrate them. Those of us who are mission driven too often don't take the time to celebrate the successes. And it's important to acknowledge that, in fact, you're making progress. The world of Boston today is not the world of Boston when I was attacked by a group of kids with an American flag. And you need to celebrate the progress that you're making. And then the other thing I would say, apart from knowing what your goals are, is to remember that self-care is essential. As mission-driven people, we think we're indispensable. And that if we take a couple of weeks off for a vacation, the world is going to fall apart. But all of the evil people, almost all of them that I've encountered or can think of, take vacations.
Really nice vacations.
Really nice vacations to beautiful places, and they play golf and they sail, and you know they go to retreats in Italy where they have chefs preparing them, you know, wonderful meals and the like. And those of us who are mission driven, you know, talk about how we don't have time to plant tomatoes. So an essential part of all of this is to pace oneself, and to make time for one's own spiritual and physical and mental health, so that we can return after a little break the next day to be even more effective than we were before. And I thought that I saw my friends starting to overcome that a few years ago, and then COVID hit, and people said, "Oh, I've got to be compulsive again. You know, I've got to be an A type." No, take a break,
Right.
and that is more likely than not to lead to positive outcomes in the mission-driven work that we do.
It is. I just want to one thing about that comment. Yes, about celebrating successes, every single one, even when they're incremental. I think this work because we often are given this notion that like you have to revolutionize everything to be successful, or like these grandiose dreams. And sometimes we have huge leaps forward, and those are amazing. And sometimes it's incremental. And even the incremental change, it adds up. If more of us are making incremental change and are sticking with it longer, it will add up. But celebrate the little things too, and have a sense of humor. I think this is another really important thing. Like, we can't take ourselves too seriously. This is serious work, but we cannot take ourselves seriously. I mean, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah.
All right, one last question, Kim, if there's a real good one to end on.
One last question. The question asker says, Dr. King's quote from his letters from a Birmingham jail has always stuck with me. Quote, "Great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner or the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action." End quote. How can we overcome this and effectively organize those that are not affected enough to get involved?
Well, I would just say that social change is not always driven by the majority, as we've seen in this country over the past decade, for better or worse. And you know, given some of my political background, I know that you go with the ones who brung you. If it takes a small group of people to change voting patterns, then you go with that small group and don't wait until you have the critical mass necessary. And that goes with all kinds of activities. If you see a solution to a problem, don't wait to have just the right conditions in place in order to begin to implement that solution. So I think that's essential. It would be great if we could bring everyone along with us, but we can't. But we can bring those along who are equipped to make change.
Maybe that's where we should end.
That's good.
Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for coming. It's cold out. Take some cookies.
Take some cookies and hot chocolate.